Did you know the full story behind Sterling Hayden's marriages? There was more to his personal life than met the eye, something he kept carefully guarded behind the scenes of old Hollywood. Was it love strategy or something deeper he was trying to conceal? Comment 1 if you always felt there was more going on. Comment 0 if you're just now ready to uncover the truth. Sterling Hayden's secret relationships in classic Hollywood, finally exposed in this video. Let's dive right in. Love loss and the search for peace. First, let's look at his personal life that he showed to everyone. Sterling Hayden's personal life, like his sprawling, unconventional career, unfolded as a deeply human journey marked by intensity, contradiction, and emotional searching. Behind the facade of the brooding screen presence, the war hero turned matinee idol lived a man constantly in conflict with the world around him and within him. His romantic relationships, much like his voyages at sea or political awakenings, reflected this inner complexity. Hayden's first marriage was to Madeleine Carroll, a luminous figure of British and American cinema, often referred to as the most beautiful woman in films during the 1930s. Elegant, worldly, and multilingual Carroll was best known for her starring role in Alfred Hitchcock's The 39 Steps, where her cool, intelligent screen persona helped define the archetype of the sophisticated thriller heroine. By the time she met Hayden, Carroll had already reached the height of international stardom. Their marriage in 1942, just as Hayden was preparing to serve in the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, was seen as a glamorous union, a golden couple of film and fame. Yet, beneath the surface, the relationship was fragile. Carroll, still grieving the death of her sister in the Blitz and becoming increasingly involved in humanitarian work, was on a vastly different emotional trajectory than Hayden, who was drawn not to Hollywood parties but to oceans books and soon covert wartime missions. The marriage lasted only a few years. Though the reasons for their divorce were never fully aired in public, many believe that their differing post-war identities, Carroll's turn toward diplomacy and Hayden's ambivalence about returning to acting, made emotional closeness difficult. Still, the marriage remained a formative moment in Hayden's early adult life, a brush with both fame and fragility. In 1947, Hayden married again, this time to Betty Ann DeNoon, often stylized as DeNoon, a former actress and aspiring writer. Their relationship was deeply passionate but undeniably volatile. Betty Ann was sharp-witted, strong-willed, and unafraid to confront Hayden's brooding nature, and in many ways she matched his intellect and intensity. Together, they had 4 children, Christian, Dana, Gretchen, and Matthew. But their household, while intellectually rich and filled with creative energy, was not free from turmoil. The years of their marriage coincided with some of the most tumultuous periods in Hayden's personal and political life. Disillusioned with post-war capitalism and drawn to leftist ideology, Hayden briefly joined the Communist Party in the late 1940s, a decision that would come to haunt him. Under pressure during the Red Scare and McCarthy era, he famously testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1951, identifying other party members in a moment he would later describe as cowardice. That decision fractured many of his relationships, and it weighed on him for the rest of his life. He would later write in his memoir, Wanderer, that betraying his conscience for the sake of his career was the most shameful moment of his life. This internal anguish affected his marriage. Hayden was often emotionally distant, plagued by depression and a profound sense of disillusionment. Though he loved his children fiercely, the domestic realm offered him little comfort. The marriage eventually unraveled into bitterness and prolonged custody battles which were widely reported in the media and left scars on both Hayden and his children. He often retreated to the sea or to isolated stretches of California coastline, chasing a kind of freedom he could never quite capture. In 1960, seeking stability after years of turbulence, Hayden married Catherine Devine McConnell, a woman whose calm presence stood in stark contrast to the chaos of his earlier years. Catherine was not from Hollywood. She was grounded, private, and possessed of a quiet strength. With her, Hayden had 2 more sons, Andrew and David. Together, they crafted a quieter life, one far from the glare of studio lights and the echo chambers of politics. Much of their marriage was spent in Sausalito, California, where Hayden lived on a houseboat named the Wanderer. It was here, between writing, sailing, and long contemplative walks, that he found some measure of peace. Catherine provided the emotional ballast he had long lacked, someone who could meet his silences without fear, his storms without retreat. Their marriage lasted until his death in 1986. As Hayden aged, he withdrew from the film world, almost entirely, emerging only occasionally for roles that spoke to his soul, such as the sardonic writer Roger Wade in The Long Goodbye, or the deranged General Jack D. Ripper in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove. But it was no longer Hollywood that defined him. It was his family, his grandchildren, the long evenings on the deck of his boat, and the journals he kept tucked away in drawers. Despite his flaws, and he never denied them, Sterling Hayden died, surrounded by the very thing he had feared he might never truly possess: a family. A legacy not only of performance, but of perseverance. His final years were marked not by celebrity, but by attempts at reconciliation with his children, with his regrets, and with the past he had so long tried to escape. And behind it there is something he tried to hide. Keep watching to find out. Hidden loves behind the silver screen. In the twilight years of his life, Sterling Hayden, once the embodiment of rugged masculinity in classic Hollywood cinema, underwent a remarkable transformation. Known for his towering frame, seafaring passions, and gravel-voiced screen presence, Hayden had been cast as everything from hardened war heroes to weary anti-heroes in noir thrillers. But as age softened him and time freed him from the obligations of stardom, he became increasingly reflective, not just about his film career, but about the deeper emotional truths he had long buried beneath his public image. In candid conversations with close friends and in fragments of unpublished writings and interviews, Hayden began to reveal a far more complex portrait of himself, one deeply marked by private longing, isolation, and a quiet rebellion against the strict codes of Hollywood's golden age. Among his most startling confessions, made only in confidence and never for public consumption, was the revelation that he had engaged in romantic relationships with several male actors throughout the 1940s and 1950s. These were not mere flirtations or one-time indiscretions. They were emotionally rich, deeply human connections experienced in stolen moments of tenderness, but always shadowed by the fear of ruin. In a studio system that upheld a brutal orthodoxy of heterosexual masculinity and treated queerness as both scandal and sickness, Hayden, like many others, had no choice but to love in silence. One of the earliest men he allegedly grew close to was Clifton Webb, a classically trained actor known for his razor wit, theatrical flair, and polished performances in films like Laura and The Razor's Edge. Webb, widely believed to be gay, though never publicly outlived a carefully controlled life with his mother and close circle of friends. To outsiders, he and Hayden seemed like opposites, one polished and urbane, the other rugged and iconoclastic. But behind closed doors, they found in each other a rare companionship. According to accounts from those close to Hayden in his later years, he described Webb as elegant, inquisitive, and infinitely more courageous than people gave him credit for. Their relationship, he implied, was built not only on physical affection, but on hours of soul-searching conversation about art, gender solitude, and the exhausting performance of masculinity demanded by the studio system. It was during this time that Hayden began to understand the emotional cost of fame not only as a burden, but as a kind of imprisonment. Another relationship Hayden allegedly cherished was with a young, then unknown actor named Anthony Perkins. Perkins, who would later gain international fame for his iconic and psychologically complex role as Norman Bates in Psycho, was at the time just beginning to find his place in Hollywood. Sensitive and deeply introspective, Perkins struggled quietly with his sexuality throughout his life, caught between his personal truths and the conservative religious values instilled in him during childhood. Hayden, already older and wearier by then, found something painfully familiar in Perkins' anxious restraint. Their encounters were brief, emotionally charged, and always wrapped in layers of secrecy, often occurring in remote bungalows in Laurel Canyon or during solitary desert weekends in Palm Springs. Hayden would later say that these moments, fleeting as they were, allowed both men a rare opportunity to drop the masks they wore in daylight. It was in those moments, he said, that the camera wasn't watching, and neither was God. Later still, Hayden spoke of a short but unforgettable liaison with Sal Mineo, the troubled star of Rebel Without a Cause and one of the few actors of his generation to explore queer-coded roles on screen. Mineo, younger and far more daring than Hayden or Perkins, represented a transitional figure, someone willing to take emotional risks, though still confined by an industry that punished authenticity. Hayden recalled Mineo as wounded and wild, a brilliant actor undone by an industry that never knew what to do with him. Their connection didn't last long, perhaps a few months, but it left a lasting emotional imprint. "I felt protective of him," Hayden once wrote in a personal note not meant for publication. "Maybe because I saw in him a version of myself that had never learned how to scream." Mineo would later die violently in 1966, stabbed outside his apartment in Los Angeles at just 37 years old. His death haunted Hayden, who admitted feeling guilt not for anything he had done, but for everything they had been forced to leave unsaid. In the final chapters of his life, Hayden did not reveal these stories to provoke scandal or seek redemption. He shared them cautiously and selectively as an act of emotional unburdening. He carried a quiet remorse for the lies he had to live, not only for himself, but for the men he had loved, men who had never been able to fully step into the light. He understood more clearly with age that their secrecy had been survival. But he also understood the emotional toll of that secrecy. The wear of constantly watching one's back, of parsing every glance, every touch for its potential to destroy. Sterling Hayden was not the only man in Hollywood with such secrets, but what made his reflections so striking was their raw honesty. In a business built on illusion, Hayden's late-life confessions offered a glimpse into something real, the loneliness behind the legends, the loves behind the locked doors. To those who later pieced together fragments of these stories, Hayden's recollections were not gossip, but history. A buried truth from a time when love had to wear disguises and when vulnerability could cost you everything. He didn't name these men to betray them, but to remember them, to honor what they meant to him and what they risked by simply being. In the end, for Sterling Hayden, the most heroic acts were not always on screen. Sometimes they were the quietest, like holding someone's hand in the dark and knowing no one could ever know. But he remembered. And in his final reflections, he made sure we would too. The Formative Years. Sterling Hayden lived one of the most unconventional and fascinating lives in 20th century American cinema. Long before becoming a screen presence, however, Hayden was already charting his own course. His early years were marked by change. After the passing of his father during childhood, his mother later remarried a man named James Hayden. Young Sterling took his stepfather's last name, an early sign of the many reinventions that would come to define his life. From the beginning, Hayden was drawn not to the glamour of film, but to the open sea. Adventurous, physically striking, and deeply curious, he chose experience over convention. He left high school in his teens and began working aboard sailing ships, eventually rising to the rank of captain while still in his early 20s. He navigated tall ships across the Atlantic and Caribbean not just as a job, but as a personal calling. To Hayden, sailing was more than travel, it was a way of life. The ocean offered something few other places could: solitude, challenge, and authenticity. This deep bond with the sea remained a central passion throughout his life and provided an escape whenever the pressures of fame or public life became overwhelming. Ironically, his entry into the film industry came by chance. With his towering 6'5" frame, strong features, and striking presence, Hayden caught the eye of talent scouts at Paramount Pictures in the early 1940s. Despite having no formal training or particular interest in acting, he was offered a studio contract. He accepted not out of artistic ambition, but as a way to fund his sailing adventures. Marketed as the most beautiful man in movies, Hayden quickly found success on screen. His debut roles in Virginia and Bahama Passage, both released in 1941, showcased his natural charisma. Yet, even in those early days, Hayden remained distant from the spotlight. He viewed acting as a means to an end, an occupation that supported his true interests. exploration, and later writing. For him, Hollywood was a world of carefully crafted personas, and he often felt out of place in it. The outbreak of World War II marked a major turning point. In 1942, at the height of his early film career, Hayden set aside acting and enlisted in the military. He joined the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would eventually become the CIA, using the alias John Hamilton. His wartime service was both courageous and significant. Deployed to remote areas across the Mediterranean and the Balkans, Hayden coordinated with resistance groups, transported supplies, and gathered intelligence under challenging and dangerous conditions. He worked alongside Yugoslav partisans led by Josip Broz Tito, and operated in extreme environments, often behind enemy lines. For his bravery, he received several military honors, including the Silver Star, the Bronze Arrowhead, and France's Croix de Guerre. Although he returned from the war a decorated veteran, the experience left a lasting impression. Witnessing the hardship and dedication of resistance fighters had a profound effect on his worldview. His experiences led him to question systems of power and to reflect deeply on justice, leadership, and global responsibility. These convictions, formed not in debate halls but in the field, shaped the choices he would make in the years ahead. Yet, in these early chapters, from his Montclair childhood to the high seas of the Atlantic and from the sound stages of Paramount to the battlefields of Europe, Sterling Hayden had already lived more lives than most men dream of. Actor, sailor, spy, dissenter. Each role added a new dimension to a man who would never be satisfied with being one thing alone. Betrayal, redemption, and Sterling Hayden's reluctant return to Hollywood. When Sterling Hayden returned to Hollywood after World War II, he did so forever changed. The man who had once risked his life behind enemy lines now stood in a city of bright lights, movie sets, and studio contracts, an industry that suddenly felt distant and disconnected from the raw realities he had faced. Although he still possessed the commanding presence and rugged good looks that had first brought him fame, Hayden now carried something far more complex beneath the surface, a deepening awareness of the world's contradictions and a moral compass that often pointed away from the spotlight. In the years immediately following the war, Hayden, like many returning veterans, found himself questioning the systems of power and inequality he saw around him. His time working closely with European resistance fighters, particularly in Yugoslavia, had left him deeply moved. The resilience, courage, and sense of collective purpose he witnessed among those groups resonated with his growing belief in justice, equality, and the dignity of everyday people. For a brief period, Hayden aligned himself with progressive political movements, including membership in the Communist Party USA. His decision, rooted in a genuine desire for a more just world, reflected the idealism of the time. But the political climate in America soon changed. With the rise of anti-communist investigations and a wave of public fear, Hollywood came under intense scrutiny. The industry was swept up in a storm of suspicion, with artists, writers, and actors pressured to prove their loyalty or risk losing their careers. In 1951, Hayden was called to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Under immense pressure and fearing for his livelihood, he chose to cooperate. He provided the names of individuals he had previously associated with an act he later viewed not as a moment of strength, but as a deep personal failure. In his powerful 1963 autobiography, Wanderer Hayden spoke openly about this decision, calling it the greatest shame of my life. But rather than hiding from it, he confronted it head-on, using the book as a space for reflection and self-examination. Wanderer is more than a story of adventure. It is a meditation on conscience, courage, and the cost of compromise. Through it, Hayden invited readers into the complexity of a life shaped by both bold action and profound regret. Despite the emotional weight he carried, Hayden's film career continued. In fact, many of his most iconic roles came after this turbulent chapter of his life. Perhaps it was this very struggle between personal ideals and public expectations that gave his characters their unforgettable intensity. In The Asphalt Jungle, directed by John Huston, Hayden played Dix Handley, a tough ex-con whose longing for a better life is constantly undercut by circumstance. His performance was raw and grounded, filled with quiet desperation and stoic resolve. It marked a turning point in his career, showcasing his ability to convey powerful emotion beneath a reserved exterior. He followed it with another landmark performance in Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, portraying Johnny Clay. Hayden's portrayal brought depth and gravitas to a character teetering between hope and fatalism, a man who seems to sense even in his moments of triumph that the world doesn't always reward careful plans or good intentions. These films, and others like them, allowed Hayden to channel the contradictions of his own life strength and vulnerability, rebellion, and restraint into unforgettable characters. On screen, he often played men caught between opposing forces and in many ways that mirrored his own journey. Perhaps Sterling Hayden's most unforgettable performance came in Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, where he played General Jack D. Ripper, a character whose unsettling intensity served as both satire and social commentary. With his calm, yet chilling delivery of lines, steeped Hayden brought to life a figure both absurd and disturbingly believable. His portrayal became iconic, embodying the tensions of a nuclear age with dark humor and razor-sharp timing. Nearly a decade later, Hayden returned to the screen in one of cinema's most acclaimed films, The Godfather. In the role of Captain McCluskey, a corrupt police officer entangled in the underworld, Hayden delivered a brief but powerful performance. His scenes with Al Pacino helped set into motion a pivotal turning point in the story, marking the beginning of Michael Corleone's transformation. Despite limited screen time, Hayden left a lasting impression, lending weight and complexity to the film's exploration of loyalty, power, and moral compromise. Though often cast as the stoic or authoritative figure, Hayden's talent went far beyond type. In the 1970s, he embraced television at a time when many actors still viewed it as a step down from film. He took a role in The Star Lost, a Canadian science fiction series that explored themes of identity isolation and survival ideas that mirrored many of Hayden's own philosophical interests. He also made a guest appearance on Banachek, a detective drama that highlighted his ongoing ability to shift between genres with ease. As the decade progressed, Hayden continued to take on varied roles that reflected his interest in complex, unconventional stories. In King of the Gypsies, he portrayed the patriarch of a Romani family, bringing gravitas to a tale of cultural conflict and generational change. The following year, he appeared in Winter Kills, a surreal political thriller filled with intrigue and dark satire. Both films allowed Hayden to explore the moral ambiguity and layered emotions that had always intrigued him. In 1980, he starred in The Outsider, a film that once again placed him in the shoes of a character navigating life on the margins. That same year, he took on a smaller role in 9 to 5, a workplace comedy that became a cultural phenomenon. Though brief, his appearance in the film showed Hayden's willingness to participate in the projects that reflected shifting societal attitudes and expanding narratives. The early 1980s saw Hayden remain active in both film and television. He appeared in Gas, a satirical comedy, and Venom, a suspenseful thriller, both of which demonstrated his enduring appeal across a wide range of genres. He also played a commanding role in The Blue and the Gray, a historical miniseries set during the American Civil War. As a Union general, Hayden embodied the quiet strength and world-weariness that had defined so many of his characters over the years. Despite his steady career, Hayden continued to live life on his own terms. A brief legal issue in 1981, related to personal possession, briefly made headlines but didn't define his legacy. If anything, it underscored his nonconformist spirit and his lifelong resistance to the conventional expectations of celebrity. Sterling Hayden was never fully at ease in the Hollywood system. He was a sailor drawn to solitude, a writer searching for truth, a performer who often questioned the very craft that brought him acclaim. His life defied easy categorization. In an industry built on image, he was unapologetically real. Whether playing a decorated officer, a conflicted anti-hero, or a man simply trying to navigate a changing world, Hayden brought honesty and depth to every role. His performances endure not just because of his talent, but because they reflect a restless, questioning spirit, a man in constant pursuit of meaning beyond the frame. Scandal, and The Search for Truth. Despite his continued contributions to cinema and literature, well into his later years, Sterling Hayden's life was never one that could be neatly packaged into Hollywood's standard narrative of stardom. His was a journey shaped as much by rebellion and contradiction as it was by talent and achievement. Even as he accepted film roles into the 1970s, Hayden remained at heart a man at odds with the very machinery that had made him famous. A notable chapter in the final years of his life came in 1981, when he was arrested at Toronto International Airport for possession of hashish. At the age of 65, this unexpected brush with the law caught the attention of the press and the public. For some, it was shocking, a stark departure from the image of the stoic war hero and silver-screen tough guy. But to those who truly understood Hayden, the incident was hardly surprising. It was a reflection of his enduring defiance of authority, his rejection of societal norms, and his deepening affinity for the counterculture philosophies that had influenced him since the 1960s. To Hayden, the arrest was more nuisance than scandal. He had long lived by his own compass, often indifferent to how his actions would be interpreted by the public. The media coverage may have momentarily reignited public curiosity about the actor, but Hayden himself seemed almost bemused by the situation. The real story of Sterling Hayden was never in the headlines. It was in the way he navigated a world he so often resisted and in the words he left behind. Though best known to the wider world as an actor, thanks to iconic roles in The Asphalt Jungle, Dr. Strangelove the Godfather, and The Long Goodbye, Hayden's most enduring legacy may lie not in film, but in literature. He was above all a storyteller, and in the written word he found the freedom and authenticity that Hollywood never quite afforded him. In 1963, Hayden published Wanderer, a raw and introspective autobiography that stunned readers with its brutal honesty. Far from the polished, PR-friendly celebrity memoirs of the time, Wanderer was a literary cry of defiance, a searing confession about fame, politics, family, and the sea. Within its pages, Hayden wrote candidly about his guilt over naming names before the House Un-American Activities Committee, his self-loathing for betraying his ideals, and his lifelong yearning for freedom. He described the decision to take his children and sail to Tahiti on a schooner, an act of rebellion against Hollywood, against government constraints, and even against the expectations of fatherhood. The voyage became both literal and symbolic, a journey toward something real. Critics lauded Wanderer as an extraordinary work of literary autobiography. Norman Mailer praised its power and rage, and it became a cult classic among artists, activists, and wayfarers who saw in Hayden a fellow traveler, a flawed but fearless truth-seeker. Hayden continued to write, and in 1976 he released his only novel, Voyage. Spanning the late 19th century, the epic maritime tale followed a New England captain on a perilous ocean journey around Cape Horn. Like Melville before him, Hayden imbued the novel with dense nautical detail, philosophical meditations, and the eternal tension between man and nature. Voyage was both a sweeping historical adventure and a veiled autobiography. It explored themes of freedom, betrayal, and the burden of leadership, all reflections of Hayden's own life. Though written as fiction, it was deeply personal. Both Wanderer and Voyage were financial successes, bringing Hayden both literary credibility and substantial income. Yet, true to his nature, he often lamented how much of his earnings were swallowed by taxes and legal fees. For a man who had always viewed wealth with suspicion, the irony was bitter. "I made a lot of money with those books," he once said, "but I never saw most of it." In 1983, 2 years before his death, Hayden's unique life became the subject of the European documentary Pharos of Chaos. Filmed in Greece and Germany, the documentary captured a weary but still fiercely intelligent Hayden, reflecting on his life often with a drink in hand and sorrow in his voice. The film presented an unvarnished portrait of a man who had lived many lives: actor, sailor, soldier, father, revolutionary, and wanderer, and who carried each identity with a mixture of pride and pain. In one memorable scene, Hayden confesses his regrets with piercing clarity: "I've played more roles off-screen than on." The documentary became an elegy in motion, a haunting tribute to a man who had spent decades seeking meaning in a world of illusions. His heavy-lidded eyes and weather-beaten face told stories that no screenplay ever could. However, Hayden's true passion was never in the performing industry. As a result, he continued to be a reluctant star, frequently fleeing Hollywood for the ocean. In Europe, he made the decision to buy a boat, and thereafter lived with his family on the canals of France, adopting a bohemian way of life. His novel, Voyage, which was published in 1896, was a vast maritime epic that represented his great knowledge of marine life and history. He was the author of various works, the most notable of which was Voyage. His poetry, much like his life, was filled with a feeling of passionate defiance and truth that was unfiltered. Sterling Hayden was a man of contrasts. He was an actor who detested fame, a patriot who was troubled by his own decisions, and a former seafarer who found himself stranded in the entertainment industry. His struggles were alcoholism, melancholy, and feelings of isolation. On the other hand, he exhibited a fiery independence, intellectual honesty, and lyrical insight. In addition to being a famous actor, he was also a philosopher in disguise. He was like a contemporary version of Odysseus looking for meaning outside the confines of the camera. Final years. During the final phase of his life, Hayden retreated more and more into solitude. After years of crossing oceans and continents, he settled with his third wife, Catherine Devine McConnell, and their children on a houseboat in Sausalito, California. There, among the fog-draped harbors and salt-stained wood, he seemed to find the only peace he ever knew. He wrote letters, smoked hashish, read poetry, and surrounded himself with books and memories. He remained haunted by his past, by HUAC, by failed marriages, by roles accepted out of financial necessity. But he also remained stubbornly unrepentant in his quest for truth. His depression, alcohol use, and bouts of self-isolation never fully disappeared. Yet, to those who visited him during those final years, Hayden remained fiercely curious, intellectually engaged, and unapologetically authentic. In the end, Sterling Hayden's greatest role was not in The Godfather or Dr. Strangelove. It was the role he played off-screen, explorer, dissenter, wanderer, writer. A modern-day Ulysses adrift in a century of conformity, always chasing a distant shore that he knew he might never reach but could never stop seeking. Sterling Hayden passed away on May 23, 1986, in Sausalito, California, at the age of 70, following a battle with prostate cancer. In the quiet coastal town he had long called home, surrounded by the sea he loved and the family who brought him peace, Hayden's remarkable journey came to an end. True to his nature, his final years were marked by introspection writing and the simple pleasures of a life well lived beyond the spotlight. His legacy, both on screen and in literature, continues to inspire those drawn to authenticity, courage, and the restless pursuit of truth. Do you think Sterling Hayden's confession will change how the world sees him? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful, untold stories.